Howdy. So I'm gonna do a updated version of the learning theories. Uh, I've done some updating in terms of an actual learning theory. I think what you'll see when I get there is something that's really different, and it is I think it's its own standalone learning theory at this point, and it's kind of complicated, but it's okay. So we're going to walk through this a little differently than I have before. Um, and it's starting with this. You might think, like, why would we be starting with talking about wealth distribution in the U.S. as a starting place for learning theories? Well, hear me out on this one. Right now, and the movement towards this kind of distribution has been there for decades, if not centuries. This kind of wealth hoarding that's going on at the top, right? The top 10% of the country has 80% of the wealth. The top 1% of the country has 40% of the wealth, okay? But the top 10% has 80% of the wealth, and the bottom 90% of the country shares only 20% of the wealth. Again, most of it being in the 80th percentile and up. Now, why am I starting here? Well, one is I think it's really important to distinguish and reframe how we look at the class structure in this country. I think there's really only two groups. Now, I realize that folks are going to have a little bit of a problem with that. So, yeah, fine. All good. Okay? But let me share with you why I am reframing our understanding of class in just these two ways. The top class there, the exploiter class, is clearly gaining a huge amount from the way in which our country is organized financially, economically, lawfully. And this has been something that's been going on for, it's all been moving in this direction really since Europeans came here. Slowly but surely, and here we are. Why does this matter to learning? Okay, I'm going to keep coming back to that. I'm not going to answer it right just yet. But the reason for two groups is, let's look at the differences between the two groups. The top group is what I'm also calling the executive consumer class. The executive consumer class, or the exploiter class, what do? They send their children to expensive private schools, and their students are seen as pre-executives. That's kind of their status as a student, right? Now that right there tells us what we think education is for. Is it really for growing people into their best selves? Is it for the greater good? Is it that kind of stuff? And the answer is no, right? Education, whether it's the private education or the public education, is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily aimed and shaped by economics, right? A class structure. So the executive class, the bosses, the owners, right, the ones with 80% of the wealth in the country, they live a very separate life from the exploited. The people that they're exploiting, they live very separately from. Every single movement that they make, there's a space for them that's separate from the people that they're exploiting. You might walk by them on a sidewalk, so I don't quite mean it that way. But I do mean it in terms of where they spend most of their time, and even how they go about sort of leisure and pleasure, right? I mean, everything. They have separate schools. They work separately. They even work very separately within the building. A lot of times they'll have a central office that's disconnected from the employees of the company and so forth. But at the very least, they're claiming their space in a different way. Their money makes more money. They don't have debt. In fact, they're in the reverse trajectory, which is that they have so much money that it just ends up making them more money. If they quit their job that day, they would still end up making more money every single day. They don't have to work, right? They work for status. That's really what they're working for. The wealth is a form of status. And then, because of their status, they pressure governments to shape public school curriculum so that they don't have to pay for educating their future workers. So this is an externalized cost. They're using public money, public schools, to train their future employees. And that is how they see it. And we openly go with that. We're supportive of that. The exploited class, the employee consumer class, their children mainly go to public schools, or they go to some private schools, but usually not the same private schools. Even within private schools themselves, there's a tier that's above the rest for the exploiter class, right? So even when they do go to private schools in the U.S., they still tend to focus on the kind of same kind of curriculum, how to become an employee, right? The children are considered pre-employee, that is their status, and we talk about going to school at the public school level for the sake of getting a job. So this is not a stretch. This is part of our vernacular. This is part of our everyday use. We put that priority on top of everything else in education, and we do that willingly. But we don't always understand the implications of what that means. This group, the exploited class, lives primarily in debt. There's a small portion of their life where they're actually debt-free. And I don't just mean credit cards, right? I mean any kind of loan whatsoever. They spend the majority of their life in debt, right? Even when they get to retirement, even if they're not living in debt, they're worried about debt. Okay? So there's an ongoing lifelong relationship with debt for this group. The group relies on consumerism for enjoyment rather than actually having wealth to subside all the anxieties. So because they live in constant anxiety about money, there has to be another outlet for enjoyment, and it becomes consumerism. Now, when we, the exploited class, engage in consumerism, just so happens we're also making the exploiter class more wealthy, right? So we can't get out of this. I love a good Marvel movie just like anybody else. Star Wars, I'm all about it. But I also realize that at some point this is making somebody in the exploiter class wealthier, right? And that's it. Like there's not much else in terms of options there, because of constantly living in debt. So consumerism itself, because of the lack of wealth in our lives, consumerism becomes a proxy for wealth. Right? We're led to believe that if we work hard enough and get a higher paying job, that's some form of social justice, which you see as the last bullet there. So we're conditioned to think that becoming a higher level exploited employee is some form of social justice. Okay. So the way that we frame that in our heads is, the bottom maybe 30 to 40% of the country lives in poverty, just stark, utter poverty. And that it's so bad that it's way better to go from the bottom 40% to somewhere in the 70 to 80%. And we call that social justice. But all we're really talking about here is a movement within the exploited class from really, uber desperate to being exploited, by the very same people that made the poverty happen in the first place. I think it's worth pointing out. I point this out all the time because we avoid talking about the what we normally call the sort of upper middle class, the 70 and 80th percentiles. Um, we avoid talking about the anxieties and difficulties at those levels, and there are many. Whether it's depression, overworking, not feeling like you have a meaningful life, everything is sort of more expensive because you've bought more expensive things. Your debt to your what do we call it? The debt to asset ratio really remains more or less about the same. You might be making 2 or 3 or 4 times the amount of salary up at the 80th plus percentile, but you're also buying a house that's 2, 3, or 4 times more expensive, and a car that's 2, 3, 4 times more expensive, right? So your ratio stays about the same in terms of debt to asset ratio, right? So we have this problem in our view, in our framing of how we think about class, right? There's a stark difference between 0 to 85, 90, where it's a climb, but it's a gradual climb, to the very steep climb that follows in the last upper 10%. We're sort of tricking ourselves into believing that there's these other classes, middle class, the poor, upper middle class, right? We're tricking ourselves into believing that those are there. And I will say this, within the larger exploited class, the types of difficulties and challenges do change, but we don't get rid of them, right? We're still being exploited, and we're just experiencing the difficulties in different ways, but it doesn't make it that we're separate from them, if that makes sense. In other words, there's no reason why somebody who's making $150,000 a year should look at the poor like they're making bad decisions, or they're they're just not doing it right. That somehow the person who's making $150,000 a year has made it. You haven't made jack. All you've become is a higher level exploited person, and that's not social justice, right? I mean, I know this is really radical thinking for a lot of people, but we're so bought into this way of thinking. We're so invested in it, right? We kid ourselves, and we tell our kids and condition them through parenting and through schooling and through the media that this is what they're supposed to do with their life to make their life meaningful and successful, is to go from one level of exploitation to the other level of exploitation. Somehow, congratulations on doing all that. It's a good thing. Okay, so what does this have to do with learning theories? Okay, I'm getting there. Learning theories such as behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism are aimed at teaching and learning for the exploited class or the pre-employees. Okay, they always have been. Behaviorism was created at the latter part of the 1800s because of a desire by the captains of industry to have robotic employees. They didn't have robots, but they could have robotic employees. To get people to be very robotic, there was a huge focus on things like efficiency, right? Scientific efficiency, work-related efficiency, and that came in through Taylorism and Fordism, right? Now we know this. We know that this happened, right? But we tend to conflate some level of higher tier employee status with words like freedom, success, even progress, education, right? We're using words that are very positively oriented in our minds, but they're attached to very economically exploitatively, there we go, connected experiences. So the reframing is step number one, because the learning theories themselves are located in the, the strong desire to exploit the employee class. So behaviorism is a learning theory designed specifically for that. Cognitivism is not that far behind behaviorism in that sense. Cognitivism tries to separate itself out by looking at things like short-term and long-term memory, which, why would that be, connected to this? Well, when it's aimed and interpreted and assessed in the way that we go about doing it right now, it gets, whether it wants to or not, located in the same framing as behaviorism, which is to say, teaching and learning to create these very docile human beings who become employees and make somebody else wealthy. And constructivism was just a fancier way of doing the same thing and getting located in the same space. So now we're connecting the personal interests and, sort of a brain organization, a schema of ideas and thoughts and all that, but we're still very much stuck with the larger goals of creating employees who are exploited. So that means that these same learning theories are aimed at keeping the bottom 90% of people only smart enough to be someone's employee, but not smarter than that. Right? Now, that, for those of you who are familiar with education, that is an echo from John Taylor Gatto. John Taylor Gatto wrote a book called, Keeping Us Dumb, right? And that is where it's at. Making people smart enough to be docile and to do their jobs, whether it's sitting at a computer or on an assembly line, right? But dumb enough not to see these patterns, not to critically examine society, not to even want to get out of these patterns, right? It is about the dumbing down. That was the title, the John Taylor Gatto. Dumbing down. Right? So the exploited class is intentionally dumbed down, but the way in which they're taught is in an extremely narrowed way so that they can be smart enough to press buttons on a keyboard and do reports, but not smart enough to actually think critically about their own situation, their neighbor's situation, the divisiveness within our own society, politics, right, and all of that. So as I start getting into the learning theories themselves, it's important to know how they were framed, what the motives were behind them, what the values were behind them as they were getting made. And there's a lot of well-intended people who are connected to these. All right, so I'm not saying these are all, in a lot of cases, these are not overtly deliberate, but they're people who are hegemonically caught up in all of this, who are not seeing their way out of it and are seeing that somehow it's valuable to participate, and this is what I mean by hegemonic, participate in their own suffering. Right? So this is a challenge right now in 2021. This is a big challenge of are we going to see the role that education can have in our society, or are we going to keep abiding by these very limited, to say the least, ways of couching and framing education? Learning has been, for over the last 100 years, has been probably about 140 years at this point, has been framed at the employee class or the exploited class. Everything that we think we know about learning has been within that context. So we're actually very limited by that context. So behaviorism There's a lot of elements to this, and the psychology classes talk about this and go into a bit more detail than this for sure, with operant conditioning and classical conditioning. But the point here, just bringing it to what we think we see through behaviorism, is that in the classroom experience, the teacher presents the content as truth, right? The students are, from a behaviorist point of view, are seen to have a blank slate, tabula rasa, in their head. That they're not, we don't know, from a behaviorist point of view, we don't really know what goes on inside the brain. So all we can do is measure the changes in behaviors. So the student's putting the right answer on a test, or doing the right thing in a presentation. That is a behavior change. We can note that, and we can see sort of a pre and a post. Or at the very least, we can see where they ended up, even if we don't do a pre. If we're not measuring growth, if we're just looking at the end point. Okay? So we have standards, and then we have standardized thought that we are asked to adhere to, which, that in and of itself should be seen as a problem. And I certainly see that. Making people adhere to certain ways of thinking is problematic, right? Can we benefit by learning about things? Certainly. But making people adhere to a certain set of right answers, and then sort of, giving them the pass to move on to the next level. That's where we're at, okay? Cognitivism is not very different. The big difference here is that there's sort of brain-based research. We have long-term and short-term memory, and we're being very aware of the kinds of patterns that move something from short-term to long-term memory. But the standpoint doesn't really change. The teacher still is the truth person. Students have to abide by that. There's really not a whole lot of room for questioning, because the point is to get the right answers. Okay? You might question something. I mean, I'm not saying, it's disallowed, but it's not emphasized. It's not something that's really encouraged in any formal way. All right? And that's the trick, because I think somebody can walk into a classroom and say, oh, well, what about this? And what about that? What about this? Yeah, you can do that, right? You're not disallowed from doing that. But what you're actually tested on is not the critical question that you just asked about. Right? What you're tested on, what you're assessed on, is up against the right answers, whatever that set of right answers is. Or skills, right? With constructivism, again, there's not a big change here. The only change here is that there becomes more of an emphasis on students and what their backgrounds are, and how their organization of thoughts is organized, right? How their thoughts are organized, and the way in which a teacher sort of moves them to the proper organization of thinking. Now, it doesn't mean that students are disallowed from having interest, right? We want to encourage interest, but this is a manipulative one for me. What we're doing here is manipulating students based on their interests. We're leveraging and sort of tricking them into caring about something via their interests, and I'm not down with that, right? There's a reason why students are pushing back oftentimes, or knowing full well it's like, I just need to acquiesce and learn this stuff, pass the test, and move on. But yeah, getting it connected to my interests, that's not going to happen. Nice try, right? And so teachers, again, very well-intended people, right? These are not evil people, but they're trying to do their best within the confines of this learning experience, which is extremely limiting. So you're in a limiting context, but you're trying to do something inspiring and empowering. You can't do it, right? We're very much imprisoned by this larger context of getting kids to be docile participants in the exploited class experience of this country, right? If you're trying to keep them from, not that teachers know that they're participating in that, right? Teachers are limited. Teachers are on a leash, right? They're controlled and dominated by the curriculum and by the technical controls and by the bureaucratic controls and by the teacher evaluations and right. And then there's also this sort of fear of maybe I won't get renewed, or maybe I'll be delegitimized, or maybe I'll have to deal with a parent, or whatever, right? And eventually, you kind of just give up. Um, so going against all of that is really stressful, and it can also potentially get you booted, right? So there's a high level of risk depending on what the individual or small community context is. So it's safer. We're talking about a job here, right? This is not activism. This is a job. You could lose your job if you don't adhere very strictly to what's being asked of you as a teacher. So, and same for administrator. Administrators have even more adherence that they have to deal with. And there's a lot of fear. And then the other part of that is a lot of not knowing of what to really do. If you're going to be smarter than an employee status person, you're going to eventually critically examine how our society is failing, how it's hurting people, how it's hurting the environment. You're going to see all of that, and at some point, it's gonna push against somebody of power, and that can have some pretty heavy-duty consequences. And even worse, if you're a person of color, right now they're going to use racism against you. If you're a woman, they're going to use patriarchy against you. If you're LGBTQI, plus, they're going to use heteronormativity against you. And you know that. You know that it's going to creep out at some point in time. Right? So there's a lot of risk pushing unless there's legitimate trust and there's people who are willing to defend and do the thoughtful work. Now, it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't. We don't have to live in a society that is deeply exploitive. We don't have to live in a society that has shaped and reshaped all of this towards one outcome, which is to maintain those two different classes. There's really, the person who's in the 95th percentile is making 2 and 3 and 4 times the amount of somebody who's in the 85th percentile. I mean, that's a steep climb, right? So they don't really care if you're happy and it seems like you're tolerating the exploitation that you're existing with, and you're fine with it. They're more than happy with it, right? And they know that. They know that when people actually critically examine things, that stuff changes. So the learning theories, all 3 of these learning theories have been done, redone, shaped, and reshaped to keep things in that exploited class set of outcomes, right? Again, very well intended, also being tricked by all of this and reinforcing it as well. Not critically examining where it's coming from, but also participating in it out of ignorance. So, as you can see, right, all 3 have the very similar outcome, which is an adherence to a certain way of thinking and then assessing. And when you put a grade on top of it, right, there's a threat now, there's a fear, there's a potential for not passing, there's a potential for being kept back. And it's all done very subtly. This is not overt, Iron Curtain kind of stuff. You're not going to be thrown into gulag, right? But you are going to get various levels of stress by questioning this. And that part is really hard for people. And I sympathize. I'm sympathizing with everybody who is dealing with this, myself included. I was a middle school science teacher and, dealt with all of this back then and felt pressure from various people whenever I started to, go in these kind of directions with students. And I didn't always know what I was doing either, because I was figuring out as I was going along too, right? But I'm really sympathetic to all of this. It's a very hard place to be. to be a thoughtful, critical person who understands all of these dimensions, and then becomes a teacher who is being asked to create very docile human beings. It goes against my nature, right? The last thing I want to do is dehumanize kids and have them feel like a dehumanized experience is what they're supposed to be as an adult. No, right? That's not okay. I'm not okay with that. Right. So, in these the similarities here, right? The teacher always has the truth, so there's a similarity. Um, the learning is what happens when students show that they have conformed or converged. The assessment process is interpreted and practiced as testing students' levels of converging and adhering to selected content and perspectives. Right? It doesn't have to be that way either, but it is. And now I will show how all of these things change when we get to the next learning theory. So, instead of, right, targeting education at becoming an exploited employee consumer, instead of having that as the target, what happens when we change that? What happens when we change it to the main target of an empowered democratic contributor? And what are they contributing towards? They're contributing towards creating more integratively thriving communities. Right? So everything I was saying before has a lot of stress to it, and it has a lot of negativity to it for sure. Right? One of the loops that we keep getting stuck in is that we just identify the problems and we have no other solution out there. And I'm certainly guilty of that. I spent years doing that. Here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. And students were, I would see it on my own evaluations. Really smart, knows what he's talking about, that kind of stuff, right? Thank you very much, appreciate it. But, talks a lot about the problems and not so much about the solutions. I hear you. And thank you for being so brave enough to actually put that on the evaluations, because I think that's huge. And I think all of the academics who are doing this work, and community organizers and all that, absolutely need to rethink how they're working with these issues. Because my students and students across the world are not wrong when they say, yeah, right, that all these things are really important, but what do we do about it? Other than have an existential crisis about it, what do we do, right? Okay, so, been listening to you. I'm right there with you. I'm very open to all of that, right? And I feel you, right? Because I feel it myself too. So, all right. So what happens if we change the target to this, right? This picture is one that I've used in probably every single presentation. In the last, I don't even know how long, right? Jessica Pearlstein has done an amazing job of creating this artwork where San Francisco is retrofitted with this kind of context in mind. And you can see all the ways in which the space is retrofitted, and presumably the level of happiness, security, and thriving well-being that emerges out of this, right? Not a perfect world by any stretch of the imagination, but better. Yeah, can I please live here now? Please, Lord have mercy. I am, I'm done with living in all of the crap that our society lives in. I am done. Right? So I feel anybody who wants to go there with me, right? Data. Let's look at some data, right? What are we looking at here? So if you take two reports, annual reports that occur, there's one from the United Nations called the World Happiness Report, and there's another that comes out of Yale, and it's called the Environmental Performance Index, and it looks at countries and ranks them. The first one ranks based on a collection of various indices that suggest that life is. I don't know if happiness is actually the right word there, but the amount of stresses that people have to deal with. It's actually focused a little more on that, right? So they look at all these different markers of socioeconomic stressors and ecological stressors too. That's part of it. So the UN has this annual report. Okay, so you see the countries there ranked 1 through 20. Now there's not 20 countries there. There's actually 17. I'll get to that in a second. And then on the right column is the ranking by the Environmental Performance Index, and that specifically looks at markers related to sustainability, environmental sustainability. Okay. There is a fairly strong correlation. 17 out of the top 20 countries on both lists are the same countries. Now, they have different ranking positions, right? So Canada, for instance, is number 9 in the World Happiness Report, number 20 on the EPI. Fine, right? But the overall trend is that if you're on top of one, you're probably on top with the other. Okay? The ones that are missing in the World Happiness Report, so for instance, 12, 13, looks like 19 is out too. Those are countries that didn't make the top 20 in the EPI. Okay? And you see that on the EPI side, those are 20 as well. Canada and Czech Republic did tie at 20. Okay, so that's why you see 20 up there twice. Anyway, there's an interesting correlation here for sure, right? That it seems, generally speaking, that whether it's the word happiness or sort of reduction of stress, when you take that and sort of couple it with sustainability, that they tend to go together. So let me go back, right? You see that represented here too. They tend to go together. Individual well-being and the larger external well-beings, the socio and ecological well-beings, tend to go together. One feeds into the other and the other feeds back, right? So out of that, I've created this thriving theory, and it has 3 main parts to it. The first part looks at well-being. The second part looks at more of a collective and external sustainability. And the third one looks at the way in which we participate. Okay? So individual well-being at these higher levels that would, in terms of a community thriving, you would expect to see something like that. You would expect to see not just individuals having higher levels of well-being, but also the collective itself, right? There would be a pretty reasonable majority of people would be experiencing that. Not that they don't have problems, right? There is one side effect to having more happiness within a community, which is that when something goes wrong in somebody's life, they actually feel worse about it because everybody else is doing so well. Why am I doing so badly? So that it has a compounding effect to it. And as long as we have awareness around that side effect, it actually can be minimized. Okay, so that's an important thing to understand. Sustainability can be looked at in terms of social sustainability and all the different dimensions of that, as well as ecological sustainability, and that they're integrated. They are deeply connected with one another, again, represented here in the artwork. And last but not least is the way in which we participate and contribute to the community and communities. Right? We're as individuals connected to many different kinds of communities, identity-based communities, sort of our local communities, the communities that we live in, places where we go and either work or school or whatever, right? There's lots of different communities that we're involved in just as individuals. So it wouldn't just be, as it sort of seems here, it wouldn't just be where you live. Although, I would take that. Right? So local to global. As I was saying before, there's this integrative mindset that I think is also at a very high level. We have a mindset of seeing how all of these things are interrelated to one another. So that's what this is really about, right? So thriving itself would also come with us collectively having an integrative mindset that social, ecological, and individual are all interconnected and are all affecting each other. Now, with that in mind, right, this is about learning theories. I sometimes have to remind myself what the heck I'm doing. It's really important, I think, to use an integrative mindset, which is what I'm doing here, right? To try to look more at education. So using an integrative mindset, what would a learning theory look like? Okay, so first things first, I'll go to the end first. We're not stopping with the right answers as the end of learning, right? What we're stopping with is students specifically, making meaningful contributions to their communities. Now think about that for a second. The difference between stopping at the right answers, think about it for yourself. Anytime you've just asked and tested, right? Anytime you've been asked to just know the right answer, put it down somewhere and get graded on it, how meaningful has that been in your life? How meaningful has that information been in your life? As opposed to when you've taught it to somebody else, and even better than that, when you've contributed to your community based on what you actually know, right? What you actually know and how you contribute to your community is going to deepen in so many ways. You're going to have nuanced views, you're going to have relational views, you're going to have contextual views, you're going to have multiple perspectives, you're going to understand why people view it in all these different ways. You're going to have a much deeper understanding that's going to stay with you for a lifetime and be built upon for a lifetime. That is learning. The fact that we have said for 140 years that learning stops at somebody giving us the right answer, that is a crime against humanity, honestly. Because what it has done is said, this is who we are. When we get to a right answer, we're done learning. That's it, right? That's all that matters. And so schools have participated in this for, a long time, 140 years at least, and certainly longer than that, because the way in which we have framed learning is that you stop when you give the right answer. When I can test you at any point in time, you give the right answer, we're done here. Move on to the next thing. Why is that a crime against humanity? Because you're not asking people to actually be part of their communities when you're asking them to learn about something. You're actually telling them to be separate from their communities. How is that not a crime against humanity? Right? Schools have been participating, and by schools, I don't mean to anthropomorphize the building, but people in schools, in school leadership, teaching, we have all been over time participating in a very dehumanizing process. How is that not a crime against humanity? Over time, right? The collective experience of it all throughout history altogether has been one of really shortchanging people. So it's time for us to move with a different target in mind, right? That's why I've created this, is to help us understand that there is something that's humanizing, that makes for a better humanity, that questions how we as a human species are, what our relationships are on this planet. And the fact that we are a terrible species right now. We don't have to be, but we're a very damaging species on this planet, right? So let's start from the beginning here. And how do we become more thriving, right? How do we not just identify the problems, but also figure out how we can start to move in much more balanced ways that contribute to individual, collective, and external well-being? We can do that. And I'm not sure why this is so missed on part of very well-intended people, but anyway. So starting in the beginning, instead of just thinking about prior knowledge, we're going to talk about prior knowledge and experiences and how they're connected to the community. If you think about how we know things outside of school, that we tend to know them through what are sort of the repetitious experiences and dialogue that's in our communities. And that we, in a way, whether we attend to them, overtly, or whether we sort of absorb them implicitly, they become part of our being. And it's through that sort of absorption or the attending to, or the attention, that we come to know things. Now, when we go to school, it's a formal process of sort of directing attention at something and then very overtly testing to see if somebody knows that information, right? In this experience here, it's really about, where does that information come from? We're sort of in I'm only in phase one right now. And phase one It's about asking students to become really aware of how they know something without it being taught to them at that point in any formal way within the classroom. Where do they come to know this? How have they heard about this? Think back to this, that, and the other thing. Might have been parents just talking about it in the house. Maybe they weren't even in the conversation itself, other than just being physically present and hearing people talk about it. Maybe it was something in the media. Maybe it was some experience that they had. Maybe, right? I mean, the list goes on, right? And we can really encourage our students to become more and more and more aware of how they're, getting that kind of knowledge and experience, right? So, you would, as a teacher, really formalize this process and spend time with it. This is not something that you just gloss over. And, the way that we do it right now is maybe 1 or 2 questions or a prompt or something like that, to get the thinking going. We're going to do initiation, right? All of these things are just so topical and so superficial, and somebody who wants to become a critical thinker is going to be very put off by this experience. I know I certainly was as a student, right? I was very frustrated at the limiting experiences that school had me going through, and I didn't have a choice. I was mandated to be there, right? Okay, so that's phase 1, and I'll show you examples of how this can be done. Okay, phase 2. This is what we're typically used to. Well, not the whole thing, but phase 2 is the teacher really taking the lead and helping the students to really understand a concept or perform a skill and get better at it, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I know we've had some discussions over the years about that, but there's nothing inherently wrong with being a teacher who's showing somebody how to do something or how to understand something, explaining something, all that. It's the way in which it's oftentimes contextualized and then aimed at assessment that becomes the problem, right? So, what are we talking about here? What does this phase 2 look like, and how is it different? Well, you see how they kind of blend into one another, right? There's those overlapping elements. There's no phase here that doesn't have some overlapping elements, if you notice. They all have overlapping elements to them, right? Phase 2 is, so you do have your content, you do have your skills, you do have the things that you're aiming to teach about. But it's not for the sake of just knowing it and getting the right answers. It is so that we can understand it, but then it's connected to the community. Again, we go back to the community and try to understand how the community understands these things. So in phase 1, it's really more about how the student understands these things and where it kind of came from in their experiences. In phase 2, there's more of a formal process now of going back to the community to really try to understand how the community situates this knowledge. And then you also see their lenses of analyses. That means that we take the information and sort of interrogate it with all these different views, right? We can do it from a critical race view, we can do it from feminist views, from anti-heteronormativity views, right? We can anti-racist views and so forth. We can anti-classist views. So we can do that. We can do it from a view of what's our connection through nature with this and so forth, right? What are some of the underlying motives and values that seem to be there? What are the semiotics that are making us sort of view it in this particular way, and what are the archetypes and what are the symbols? Like, there's so many different ways that we can have students interrogate that with a set of different lenses and keep shifting, right? And also relocating it back in the community, finding out how that is situated in the community itself. So that's phase 2. It's a lot different than what we do now. I started saying phase 2 is like, oh, this is what we're used to now. Actually, it's not true, right? It's only the beginning portion of where the teacher teaches it and make sure that everybody knows the content. Here, I wouldn't even recommend that you do sort of quizzing and testing. 1, you can find these answers all over the place, the internet. Why do I need to be tested on something that I can find at any point in time? Why does it have to be in my head, given that I can find it any place? Right? 2, decontextualizing information is dehumanizing. It needs to be contextualized. It needs to be looked at from different angles. When you're doing that process of contextualizing it and connecting it with various lenses of analyses, you're going to learn it much deeper just by doing it that way. Just by doing it that way, right? As a teacher, the way in which I go assessing now starts to really change. I don't have to ask students for a set of right answers anymore. What I have to do is see how they're working with it, see how they're thinking about it, see what they can do with it, right? And it's all open-ended, but at least I can see how they're doing it and how they're forming their thinking around it. And should there be some real hiccups and bumps in the road, I can work with those, right? I can help them see where that seems to be falling apart or going down the wrong path that I think is the wrong path or whatever, right? So, and then sometimes it is. They just need to have a basic skill so that they can go further with it. Absolutely. So maybe that is part of it. But we can, just like in life, if somebody's teaching me how to change the oil in my car, they're not giving me a paper and pencil test. Be like, well, what part of the engine filters out the oil? Is it A, the oil filter, B, the gas? No, right? That's dumb. We don't need to do that. And we don't need to collect data in that kind of way. All of this has been deeply dehumanizing, and we know this. But we participate in it constantly, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic, and the states are not, in any way, shape, or form, relinquishing their death grip on testing. They want it, they need it, and plenty of teachers are like, yeah, well, we still need this data. Come on. No, we don't. Right? Because we do such a crappy job teaching in the first place that we're not asking kids to learn things in any real way. So the only thing that we can do is collect data on them, right? Like that's the best way that we can do this, is sort of threaten them with testing. Come on, right? Enough already. We don't need to go at this level. So phase 2 is putting all of that aside. The assessments themselves are changing as we're doing this. And then we shift into phase 3. And phase 3 is a much more specific exploration than phase 2. Phase 2 is sort of the general understandings and the way in which it's situated within our communities and, doing lenses of analyses. But phase 3 is much, much more specific. So out of that sort of general understanding of things, I am, Kurt Love. I am a person who has certain things that I want to do in life, that I want to be connected to, I want to contribute in various ways. There's things that I care about that others may not care about, and I may not care about the things that they care about quite as much. We can't all do everything, but we do have within ourselves oftentimes something that we actually genuinely care about. And if I follow that feeling of purpose within me, I can figure out now, in connection with issues that are in our community, where we have some thriving that might be compromised, where we might have areas for growth, or where we might actually be doing really well. Maybe we are doing something really well within our community, and we actually are thriving in that way. And maybe I can contribute even more to that, to have it be maintained or grow. So it doesn't always have to be that there's a problem. It can also be that we're contributing to something that's actually doing well too. That's fine. It's great, right? But the one thing that we constantly do, and this is a big red flag for me, public education, rarely in any formal way ask students to go within themselves, to figure out who they are, and go through a process of connecting to the greater world and their purposes to the greater world in connection with the content. We almost never do that. And that right there should be a big eye-opener, right? All we're doing is trying to control people and not differentiate them. What we're trying to do is make them all the same and give them a bunch of more supports so they can all be the same, right? That is such a problem. we should be able to be the best versions of ourselves, and we should have an education experience that's pushing us in that way, right? So that's where this path part comes in, and it's formally present. So now what, right? So now you have all this content from phase 2. You have these deeper understandings from phase 2, and then you start to make a choice. What do I want to do with this? What do I want to understand more? Where do I want to go further? There was something that we talked about that I want to know more about, and I can see that it has some connections with our community, whatever the community is that you're thinking about, and I want to do some level of contribution around that. Awesome. There's phase 3. Right? Phase 3 is path oriented, and it's moving from the content through one's path, connected to the community, and providing a contribution. There's a lot of work to do there, right? And we're talking about kids, so that alone could take a lot of time. It could, right? And I know a lot of people are going to look at this and go, I don't have the time for this. You do. I'm going to tell you this. You do. Go to your administrators, go to your department meetings, and start pushing for this kind of education. You have the time to do this, but you're being pushed in a way that is very, very limiting right now. Go and have these conversations with each other. Do it, right? For the love of God. I have, first-year teachers who want to do this kind of work, and they come back every single time and say their schools are not being supportive of this kind of work. Go and have these conversations, right? It has to happen. So that phase 4, we're not done learning until they've actively made the contribution in their communities, right? I think the easiest way to do this, and I don't mean it as easy, but I just mean easiest way of doing this, is to actually have these formal gatherings within our communities where people can have these conversations with students and see what the contributions are. And, maybe it is just a dialogue that's the contribution. Fine. That is amazing. That would be great. I would love to see that happen. I would love to go to my kids' school and see my kids engaging with the community and asking the community really thoughtful questions. Not just some sort of weird parade show and tell of the weird, work that they did. Right? I mean, as a parent, I'm talking now. I would love to see my kids doing this kind of work from kindergarten on, preschool on, honestly. Not just some sort of presentation of whatever. Some like I said, some sort of weirdo thing. Or I'm like, oh, okay, great, you did that. Cool. I mean, good for you, right? Good for you. But, what does this do for us? Other than make you feel good about yourself. Which, love you. I'm glad you feel good about yourself. Right? Good job. You did what was asked of you. I'm proud of you. Good job. Right? And it's not their fault. It's not about them. It's not about my students. It's not about my kids. They didn't do anything wrong. They just did what was asked of them. Right? It's the adults. So whenever I go to these experiences, I look around and I see what's being asked of the kids, and I'm like, here we go. Here we go. Here's what the adults, right? They're flatlining here. Got it. Okay, cool. Right? So I don't want to live in the flatland anymore. Right? I want to live in a space where we're doing some really meaningful work together. And that's what this learning theory is about. So the learning itself is not done until there's contributions being made. And again, think about how rich of an experience that is to have gone that far with learning about something that you're now able to provide a meaningful contribution, not something that's just a contrived, but something that's meaningful. Right? So let's do this. Let's look at this. Right? I've taken up a lot of your time already, but let me do some application here. So let's say we're doing this. I was a 7th grade science teacher. I taught the cell organelles, right? So let's say we're doing that, right? So the behaviorist approach, you can see here, is grounded in philosophy of realism. Philosophy? What? Yeah, we don't teach philosophy, and so people don't even know how to philosophically think about things, which is one of the big reasons why we're stuck in the holes that we're stuck in. So another conversation for another day. Teach philosophical thinking, please. Okay? So what are we doing here? Students need to demonstrate that they understand the facts nearly verbatim. This is behaviorism. This is how teaching methods get translated by behaviorism, right? I think anybody who's behaviorist would look at this and go, whoa, it doesn't have to be this way. I know. But this is how it tends to be done, right? Students will be given a drawing of a cell. They need to identify the names and provide the organelle's functions. A core assessment, they need to show in writing that they can provide the names of the organelles, right, and then accurate descriptions. This can come in quizzes and tests and so forth, right? Labels and drawings and whatnot. Very standard kind of stuff here. Connections to real world, none, literally none, right? And this kind of learning has done little, if anything, to have a connection to the real world. The larger goal, and people will pat themselves in the back and say, "Woo, STEM." I mean, no, right? You're not. If that's what you're doing, then all you care about is making STEM employees, and that's about as much of a real world connection as that you're going to make. So knowing this content might help, because they're going to come up against it again in college, right? So, great, right? But the fact is that they're going to come up against the same exact content in much more detail in college. Okay, great. Cognitivism. So here I'm just identifying the changes by the different color, right? So it's just in the teaching methods itself. Since we're shifting to short-term and long-term memory, we're going to do things like acronyms and graphic organizers, and but really at the end of the day, they still need to do some rote memorization. Okay, so nothing much has really changed there. Constructivism is, there's some changes here. We changed the philosophy. We get a little more humanism and multiculturalism going on. Students connect with their own interests and learn through their interactions and the teaching methods. They will work in small groups to build their own cellular model, coinciding with the presentation. All right, students research, maybe they research some female cellular biologists and some cellular biologists of color. Let me pause on there for a second, right? So there's some room here in constructivism for some exploration of inclusion, right? But that's about it. The going to look at the power issues and larger issues in society are just, it's not hitting the mark here. It's sort of the feel-good inclusion that becomes the limit, if at all, right? So anyway, the core assessments are all still the same except for the small group presentation with their own model of the cell. As much as it may be interesting to a particular student, it's probably mildly so for the most part, with a few exceptions. So still no real difference. Again, remember, the end point has not changed from behaviorism to cognitivism to constructivism. We're still about getting the right answers, ultimately. Now, with this sort of critical constructivism, which I've pushed even further into integrative constructivism, we have a lot of different philosophies going on here. Students will examine science in the context of equity, inclusion, justice for the purpose of becoming scientifically literate community members who democratically work with others towards thriving, right? Students will examine things like cancer clusters, Tuskegee, research ethics, Henrietta Lacks, Rachel Carson, Barbara McClintock, Rosalind Franklin, patriarchy in research. They will investigate our local community's views on cell-based issues like stem cell research, chemical fertilizers, genetically modified foods. Certainly, we could look at viruses. Right? There's a lot more to go in here. Now, some would say, well, you just said cell organelles. If you had said viruses, we could include that in the other three as well. Yes, true. Right? But because the push here is to broaden out to things that are actually affecting us, we would obviously want to start talking about the pandemic, right? And again, the other ones would too, but this would now be connected to things in a much more meaningful way because of what's going to happen next, right? So we're getting there. So it's not just knowing this stuff and ending there, it's now doing something with it, right? They compare the structure and function of a healthy lung cell with a cancerous lung cell. They can research consumer-based practices that lead to cancers, and they will develop personal plans for their own cellular health and community plans for more cellular health. So that last one is starting to get into that phase 4 and phase 3 and phase 4, right? Again, it's really more integrative constructivism than critical at this point, because even critical would fall short of doing a lot of where I'm going here. And you'll see in the very last slide why that's the case. So the core assessment students do, maybe they still have to do a test, right? Although I don't think it's actually necessary very much anymore because of what they're going to do that follows. but they what they do need is still to have a basic understanding of the content. I mean, we're not getting rid of that. And I think that's an important point here. We're definitely not getting rid of that. In fact, we're intensifying it because of all the nuances and connections that we're making with it. So to do the larger project, they're going to need to have that, the, the basic content in mind. Sort of phase two is going to happen, but it's not just going to be the basic content. It's going to be through various lenses and through connections with community. Students provide reports about each of the previously mentioned topics and discuss implications with each other and at home in order to increase awareness more broadly in the community. Connections to real world, it's all over the place, right? There's so much more going on here. In real terms, this is a preparation for becoming an involved democratic community member who has a high scientific literacy. In order to become a more thriving community, there is a need to increase knowledge and awareness in order to help with personal and collective cellular health. The community extends to nature. Right? Let's not forget that we are very much a part of nature as any other living species. And it is our home and it needs to remain in balance. Our cellular healths need to have humans seen as part of nature and nature as a vital part of our community. This is more than just getting highly paid STEM job after college. So here's what this would look like. So if we did this in a 20-day unit, we'll say that it was, 4 or 5 week, 5, yeah, I can do this. 4 weeks, sort of 5 days a week, right? So 20. So phase one, right? This can be an inquiry into just public health issues and challenges. It doesn't have to be, let's ask the kids what they know about cell organelles. That's not the larger goal, actually. The larger goal is to understand the content so we can move it back to the end, which is public health issues and challenges. And if that end point changes at some point, that's okay. But we do have the end in mind here. So if you are thinking about backwards design and all that, it's a different kind of backwards design, but it's there. So public health issues and challenges, right? So asking the kids about that, what do they know, what do they hear? And as a teacher, you'd have a ton of questions that you can keep asking them, and they can get on the internet and check out some things, and maybe have an article or so to open things up, or some sort of common experience to open it up to get things going, which is fine because that is a good kind of initiation in my mind. And I'm not like anti-initiation. I'm just anti-initiation the way that we do it right now. The initial description of thriving patterns, we want that too. So within phase one, it should really be two parts, which is what do you know about things, and then what do you think the overall patterns would be if we were thriving? Are they what we have now? Would they be different? Do we need to go somewhere else with this? What? So it's that kind of two-part view, right? Phase two. Now this was where we get into the deep dive, and that the teachers would take a little bit more of the driver's seat, and let's Miss Frizzle this, right? Let's do this. So, deep dive into concepts of cellular processes, especially focusing on challenges to public health and maintaining high levels of public health. So that context hasn't been lost just because we're talking about cell organelles. There may be a time where we have to just kind of go through some of the things that aren't sort of inherently and directly related to that, and that relationship isn't there on the surface right away. That is okay. You can teach without going to the relationship at every single point. It's just, you got to make sure you come back to it in meaningful ways, right? So additionally, we can also dive into the issues of social injustices connected to cellular research, contrasted with thriving practices in science research. So, as I said before, the Henrietta Lacks and Rachel Carson, her work with DDT, her work with the oceans, Rosalind Franklin, her work with X-ray crystallography and the DNA molecule and patriarchy and harassment that happened there. Yes, you can absolutely go into those, and you can go into them as a group, right? It doesn't have to be individualized. It doesn't have to be differentiated. We can all go through this as a group. So yeah, right. Let's do that. Let's look at things like larger patterns of pollution. Let's look at Flint, Michigan, and see what happens to neurological health. How does that translate into depleting the brain? Why are neurons, which are at the cell level, having a negative reaction to what's going on in Flint, right? So yeah, like there's a lot that you can do here just in phase 2. So you could do all that really good work. It's not just Flint, right? I just brought up Flint, but a lot of other communities are dealing with the same kind of problems, just not making the news quite as much. Anyway, but you can do a lot of this work in phase 2. Phase 3, remember, this starts with that connections with path, and then really specializing in more information connected to the larger content, right? So it basically is like a mini research project. It's very much guided by their own personal paths, and if they don't feel like they have a personal path that connects to this, we can still work with that, right? It doesn't always have to be this deep resonating feeling that goes along with everything that we learn about. That's not going to happen. But we can work with it. We can work to see where the connections can at least be made that can strengthen their path and their broaden their path as they become older, and maybe they shift their path. I don't know. But so then there's this contrasting with practices that could build in high quality public health. So we will look at the very specific issues of the community in relation to public health, as in relation to cellular processes, which is in relation to the content. And then we can do this contrasting view. Just like in phase 1, you have this second part here too. Let's look again at what we think thriving looks like. And you're much more informed at this point, and really start to do that kind of contrasting if the thriving is compromised, or is currently compromised. What would the contrast look like? Or if we are thriving, if we are doing a good job, how do we maintain that, or how do we do that even better? So that's phase 3. Now, that lends itself to some kind of contribution. And I know that as a teacher, a lot of times kids are going to be flailing all over the place and floundering, trying to figure out what that would even be. I get it, right? So a lot of this is going to have to be teacher directed in some ways. It may very well be that going from phase 2 to phase 3, that as a teacher you only provide some options as opposed to just the entirety of the landscape that's available to them, right? Sometimes when things are too open and they're not used to this process, especially, that students are not, they're just going to be overwhelmed by all the possibilities. Fine. Narrow it down to 4. Narrow it down to 5 things that they can choose from. Work in small groups and go for it. I don't care, right? Is that a compromise that brings the whole thing down? No, it's not. It's fine, right? I want to see students getting into these patterns. I would love to see my kids having these patterns, right? I have very well-intended teachers that are teaching them, but we never go here. We never get to this place, right? It's like a, it's a wind tunnel. Nobody knows. Yeah. Anyway, you get lost in it, and I get it. Again, it's a frustration of mine, but I'm not critiquing them as people. I just am. I want my kids to grow up to be really thoughtful human beings, and I am a parent, so I play a major role in this, and I do this all the time with them. But it's frustrating to see that it's not being reinforced in the schools, because that would be a great place for that to happen. So, all right. So then we go to phase 4, right? So that contribution, maybe with the help of the teacher, just to get things going. But maybe the students have done this so many times now that they're really good at figuring out what kind of contribution they can do. Anyway, phase 4 is now making that kind of the final preparation and getting ready for what could be a community night, where we're going to talk about this as a community, right? Maybe it's the students leading a whole group discussion with community members focusing on local public health issues and possibilities for change. Cool, right? I think that there's a lot here, and to teach this way, you need guides, and you need a format that you can follow. You need steps that you can follow. The beginnings of all of that is here. It's all here, right? I think as we figure out this kind of education and the learning theory itself, as we figure more and more of this out, we'll figure out how to do this better. Right now, we're at the very beginning stage of teaching this way. We certainly can do it. And I guess I'll end with this note in mind. This is not any one particular bias towards politics or any of the stuff that we get really tripped up on in our society. Because it's locally based, because it's connected to the communities themselves, that's all that it is. It's just it's community based, right? It's not about favoring one political persuasion over the other. It's not about being a leftist or a rightist or any of that stuff, because I think even out of this frame, with it being contribution oriented within the community, I think there's a lot of space here for people to figure out their own paths, for one, right? But there's a lot of choice here, and it really shouldn't be about any one particular political or critical view overtaking. If that becomes the case, then we're verging on indoctrination, right? That being the case, we have engaged in indoctrination for years and years and years with education. We've been very selective of what gets taught, why it gets taught, and who's being served by it. So, and people are going to be all over the place on what they think that statement means, but you get the idea, right? One of the things that I would say to administrators and teachers and parents is leave it open. Leave it open for exploration. Don't get so hung up on some sort of specific ideology that needs to be adhered to. Everything, we need to get our kids into a space where they can be questioned about what they're thinking, be comfortable with that, so they can question and engage with others. We suck at this, and they need to have adults who can help them be much better at this than our generations are, right? So if you were sort of listening to this, being like, "Oh, this is a very leftist this or that," no, right? Like, no. This is about having an open, authentic exploration that's attached to learning, right? And we're never going to be a problem-free society. That's not the goal here, but we can do better, right? So, shifting from making kids, stuck as employees to empowered contributors within their communities, and that's really what this is about, right? So you've seen how these dynamics really change, just with that change in focus, right? So there you go. That is that. Take care.